Now we'll get into the actual depreciation components. So depreciation rules change frequently because depreciation is one of the primary tools that the government uses to stimulate the economy, allowing businesses to depreciate more quickly, incentivizes businesses to invest in more PP&E. So when the government's trying to stimulate the economy, it helps when they allow depreciation to occur more rapidly. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expanded some depreciation rules, so we're going to talk about that towards the end. But I want to start by saying the 4 essential components to calculate depreciation. All right, so the 4 components that we have to have in order to calculate depreciation: first, the depreciable basis. All right, so that's our original basis less any Section 179 expense. Section 179 expense allows you to immediately deduct some amount, and we'll talk about 179 at the end of the lecture. So if we're taking any 179, that reduces our original basis, and the depreciable basis is what is left. If we aren't taking any 179, then the depreciable basis is just the original basis. All right, next we need to know the depreciation method. We call MAKERS our most common method. It's basically 200% declining balance. So remember when you learned double declining balance for financial accounting purposes, that's what we're using for tax purposes most of the time. So we use 200% declining balance for personal property, and then we use straight line for real property. Other methods that can be used are straight line for personal property over the MAKERS period, and then the alternative depreciation system, which is used for AMT. We're not covering B or C. We're focusing all of our attention on MAKERS because that's what's most commonly used. Businesses are going to select the depreciation method to be used for similar assets purchased during that year. So the same method has to be used for all assets purchased during the same year, but similar assets purchased in different years may be subject to different types of depreciation. So in theory, you could choose straight line for your personal property that you put into place in 2018, and then you could use MAKERS for the property that you put into place in 2019. But you have to use one method for the entire year. For our purposes, we're assuming MAKERS for the purposes of our class. They're not going to be switching between the methods, but in theory that could happen. But for assets placed the same year, you have to use the same approach. All right, so the first 2 things we have to know for depreciation: depreciation basis, depreciation method. The next one is the recovery period. All right, so I always tease that you don't really need to know this for my class. When you get to the CPA exam, you do need to know typical recovery periods for certain types of assets. So we have typically, you've heard useful life is what we've called this up until this point. What's different is in tax, the government tells you what the useful life is. And I'll give you some examples as we work through the problems. You're not going to say, oh, I think that this computer is going to last me for 4 years. No. For certain types of equipment, machinery, property, the government is going to tell you what the life is that you're going to use. We also use the useful life given to us by the government, whether the asset is brand new or acquired used. All right, for purposes of our class, I will tell you this on the exam. I'll tell you the useful life. On the CPA exam, you won't be able to do that, or they won't tell you that. You'll be expected to know. All right, then the 4th component that we have to know in order to calculate depreciation is the convention. So convention is a new term for us. Convention is meant to simplify the calculation of depreciation. So let me give you an example. We have the half-year convention. And I'll show you that we'll use that primarily for personal property. It's the default approach. So rather than counting the number of days that you have the computer during the year, we go to a convention and the default is half year. So we pretend like you bought that computer and put it into service halfway through the year, whether or not that's true. Because it simplifies the depreciation calculation rather than having everybody count the number of days they had this computer and count the number of days they had the furniture. It makes more sense to use a convention and say, we're just going to pretend it was half the year, because probably you purchased some at the beginning of the year, probably you purchased some in the middle, and probably purchased some at the end. We have other conventions that we use in other situations, and we'll work through those together. But the idea behind it is to simplify. And you can tell me if you think it's simplified by the time we've done this. But I'm going to say this is how we pretend we put the asset in service. So if we're using half year, we pretend that we're putting the asset in service on July 1st, right halfway through the year. And so that first year, we would take a half of a year of depreciation. You do not choose your convention. So you don't choose the convention. The tax law tells you which convention to use. So that's something that you will be expected to know, is what is the appropriate convention that you should be using. That's not something that I will tell you on the exam. So the method, the recovery period, and the convention are all based on whether the asset is real property or personal property.